Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. And last week I did a video on the subject, no one is buying positive reviews. No one's writing a check to content creators to give you a positive review of their game. And this video is a follow-up to that video. Now, I always planned on doing a follow-up. I planned on doing one several weeks out, but based on the comment section, which I'll explain shortly, I decided to do this video sooner than I otherwise planned. And so some context in case you didn't watch that. The very short version is I put out a video saying no one's buying positive reviews, and the idea that I had was the literal definition of no one is writing a check to get positive coverage, which is an accusation I've seen thrown around over the years always, but more so recently I've seen it around a bunch of games that the public or certain people in the public have decided are games that shouldn't be liked, and then when content creators seem to like them, the content creators are bought and paid for. And I specifically said in the video that this is not about bias, this is about the literal writing of a check. And despite that, a good portion of the comments were talking about bias. And so I decided that this follow-up video, which I had planned on doing several weeks out, is going to be done today instead. Today is still like a week from, that video. But with that, let's go on into this. And so this video is about the subject of bias. Now, I will say, if you're not subscribed to King of Average, go ahead and check him out because I know he mentioned that he will be doing a video on the subject. I don't know if it'll be going up before or after this video, so feel free to check that out and see what he has to say on the subject because I'm sure it'll be an interesting video. I always enjoy his content. But with that, let's go ahead and talk about bias. And also, in case you're wondering, these three games are just because I like having games in my videos. It reminds people that my channel is about games, even if I'm not talking about it. And so these are all upcoming reviews, and they're going to consist of a game I loved, a game I liked, and a game I would rather not play again. You can sit there and feel free to guess which one is which, or just say subscribe to the channel, where I'll be having reviews of all of these. In fact, one of these may be going up before this video, so maybe you already know. Either way, let's talk about bias. Timestamps down below in case you want to jump to any relevant section. Bias is a real problem in board games. Contrary to my video or in any field, I'm talking about board games because I like board games. But bias is a real problem, and it's not as simple to dismiss as it was the concept of buying reviews. I think people buying reviews, I think it's garbage. People don't buy reviews. People don't sit there and pay for positive content. They pay for coverage. There are channels that pay for coverage, but they do not pay for positive content. Now, bias is an entirely different conversation, and I have written down on my little sheet attached to the camera the 8 versions of bias I can think of, 2 of which are not really relevant to this video, and then the 6 that are. And I'm sure there's more. If you think of any others that I missed, by all means, let me know. Maybe I'll talk about it in the week in review or who knows when. But also, I forgot, later today, make sure to pay attention to this video later today, because one of the reasons I thought it'd be a good idea to talk about this video today is because later this day, I will be doing one of my first sponsored videos on this channel. I don't generally do sponsored channels. I don't generally do sponsored content. I did a paid Pledge Manager walkthrough once for a game that I already had reviewed and loved, and this is going to be one of the second videos on my channel. I think it's only the second video where I am effectively showing you a game table. I'm going to be showing you the Cassidy game table, which is right off shot over here, and I'll be telling you all the things I liked and didn't like about it, and understand that if you buy it, I will get a commission of that sale. I'll talk about that in that video, but understand that. I think this is a good time to line up a conversation about bias because that certainly, absolutely, 100% introduces bias. So that will be going up later today. So let's go into the 8 forms of bias. Again, I'm sure I've forgotten some. The 2 that I will not be talking about that are not the subject of this video are going to be biases around your personal, about whether you like the game, but kind of ignoring a different kind of bias. Number 1 is going to be the kinds of games you like and don't like. I have a bias towards powers and abilities. I have a bias towards area control. I have a bias against campaign games. There's going to be a lot of different aspects that literally just come down to our personal taste, but absolutely bias the coverage that you put out. There's going to be bias, not paid bias, not bias that affects, what games you do or don't get, your relationship with publishers, none of that. But there absolutely is bias if you're watching a content creator and you're like, well, they love that game. Well, if they like area control and you don't, understand that bias is part of the conversation, not the subject of this conversation. A second form of bias, which is a little harder to account for, is going to be the bias of the people you play with positive or negative. That's going to be the idea that you can have a fun time playing a mediocre game with a good group of people. You can have a bad time playing a great game with people who aren't into it. There is certainly bias with the people you play games with, which is why, to a certain extent, I don't always get to do it, just the nature of game groups, but to a certain extent, I do try to experience games with different people. I'll try to play it solo and with a group. I'll try to play it with my wife and with some friends. I'll try to do different things when I cover a game, especially if I feel that the group or the people I played it with were either too into it or not into it enough. Again, I don't always get to do it. It's an unfortunate reality that sometimes I don't have the time or the people who are interested or the right player count to be able to play a game with different groups of people, but the groups of people you play a game with can absolutely bias your coverage of a game. I may think a game was great because I had a great time playing a mediocre game. I would argue most party games are going to fall in that category. I would argue most people who say, I love Monopoly but haven't played it in 15 years are remembering the fun times they had playing a game rather than the game actually being good. So the social bias is absolutely a bias present in board game review content, but again, not the subject of this conversation. The 6 forms of bias I do plan on talking about, I'll rattle them all off right now, and then I'll go into each one in depth, are going to be as follows. There's going to be the bias of people who simply do not like being negative, period. They just don't want to avoid negative content. There's going to be the bias of friendships and relationships. There's going to be the bias of working directly with people. It doesn't have to be a friendship or relationship, but literally just having a conversation where someone sends you a game, it's going to introduce a form of bias. We'll talk about that shortly. There's going to be the bias of money, the obvious bias of just literally taking a contractual obligation to do a playthrough of a game, to preview a game, and the bias that will introduce. There's going to be the bias of people not sending you games if you're too negative, being concerned that if you are too negative about a game, about a prototype, about a Kickstarter, about a retail copy, that various publishers will not send you the game. And then lastly, there's going to be the bias of cult of the new. And let's go into each one of those in detail, as well as talking about how I think I personally am affected by it. Understand that I am biased when I tell you which one of these are my own personal bias. To begin with, I don't like being negative. Well, let's talk about the general concept, then tell you about myself. So there are people who don't like being negative about board games. Board games are a passion project. Many content creators start doing it because they just love the hobby. They want to talk about things they love. I love sharing games that I love with you. I am excited when I get to tell you about the next 5 out of 5 I have. And that's something I like doing. I don't get excited telling you how much I dislike the game. I don't get excited telling you how little fun I had playing this game and how much it's not worth playing. That's not what I get energy or passion out of. It's not why I review games or talk about games. If you've watched this channel long enough, you hopefully know how much I am in love with the hobby in general and how much enjoyment and how much value games add to my life. And that value comes from the enjoyment of them. The value comes from the collections, the following, the Kickstarters, the seeing what I can get, the acquiring, the reading the rules, the setting it up, the playing it, and even, yes, the moving on from it. None of that enjoyment comes from me telling you, this was a terrible game. I did not enjoy playing it. I do it. I do it because it's something that I think is almost necessary the larger you get. The smaller you are in the space, the more you can afford to simply talk about the things you loved. The larger you're going to be as a content creator, the more I think you will need to round out your content, if only to provide validity to the idea that you are willing to be negative about games. Still, a vast majority of I would say if you pick any sampling of games, you pick 10 games I loved and 10 games I don't love, you're going to find far more reviews from me on the ones I love than the ones that I am getting rid of. I'm just less interested in doing negative content. I'm less interested in playing games that I didn't love again, just so I can be sure that I am safely telling you I didn't love it because I gave it the required 3 plays to be able to say that. And 3 plays may not be enough for you. Maybe you want 5 plays. I don't know what it is, but there's going to be a bias against being negative, a bias against playing games you don't like so that you can properly review it. That is going to introduce a bias not between the person and the publisher, but between the content that a person is willing to put out. The content any content creator is willing to put out in this space is going to be biased by that. I know multiple channels who straight up will not do negative content because that doesn't bring them joy, and they're only doing this for joy. I know people who just don't like the negativity associated. I know people like myself. My biggest problem is going to be that I don't want to play a game again that I didn't like. The larger I have gotten in the space, the more I force myself to get additional plays in because I feel I have a certain sense of obligation the more the channel grows, but I don't like it. I do it because I think it's important versus I like telling you how much I loved a game. So the bias against being negative is certainly a thing that you have to be mindful of as you watch content creators and as you see more positive content than negative content. That's going to be one thing. So there's going to be 7 biases, because I forgot another one, so I'll get to a second. As far as how it affects me, like I told you already, it will affect my content. The amount of things you see from me will be, I mean, in general, watch my videos on the games leaving the collection. That's where you'll see any game that I get that leaves the collection will be covered in those videos. So you'll always see what enters or leaves my collection. But the amount of time, energy, and attention I'm willing to give the things I was less interested in, I don't want to as much. And so it will bias my content towards positive. The second bias, which I forgot, there'll be timestamps, so you'll see it. The second bias is going to be self-selection bias. Self-selection bias is the idea that us people who play games for fun and then tell you about their experiences versus people like the Dice Tower who will play many games that I would never touch with a 10-foot pole, but they feel they want to cover all the games. There's a difference between those two types of things. I don't know many channels past the Dice Tower who really just cover anything. The Dice Tower covers anything. I think most other people have a degree of selection bias in the stuff they cover. That selection bias is going to be, hey, I'm interested in these 3 games. These 3 games look interesting to me. Let me go ahead and play them. And the very fact that they look interesting to me gives me a higher likelihood of me enjoying them to some degree. It doesn't mean I'll love them. Like I said already, there's one here I love, one here I like, and one here I'd rather not play again. If you look at most of my ratings, my most common rating is going to be a 3 out of 5. For me, my rating system is going to be a 1 is a bad game. I don't rate games 1. I think I've rated 1 game, maybe 2 games. I've rated 2 games in the past year and a half have been given a 1, but I didn't talk about them on the channel because I was not willing to give them a second play. There are a few games I gave a 2 to. 2s are going to show up a little more often, a little more frequently, because 2s are not horrific games. They're just games that I'd rather not play again, but I see their value. 3s are going to be the most common rating on this channel. They are good games. Many, many games are good. 4s are great games, and 5s are the best games for me. Their 5s still show up, but they're the best games, the ones I really love and don't see leaving in a long time. And so 3s, a good game is going to be my most common rating because most games are good, especially if you are operating under a self-selection bias. If you're operating under a self-selection bias, as like I said, most content creators I believe do, then you're going to try to seek out the games that look good to you. You're going to try to seek out the games that look like they are interesting to yourself, and you're going to play those games and cover those games. But you didn't seek out things that didn't look interesting. Something that had horrible art, that didn't look like it's the genre you like. Self-selection bias will bias content on a channel towards being positive just by the very nature of, well, self-selection. And again, I'm definitely going to be impacted by that. The amount of Kickstarters I've said no to, the amount of preview games I say no to because it's not something I would have backed, so I'm not going to cover it. Meaning, let me phrase that. It's not something I would have considered backing, so I don't cover it. Or I would have considered backing it, but I read the rulebook and that introduces the self-selection bias. I say no to a lot of things, both personally and my own interest level of what I back, as well as what people are going to send me, and then I say no thank you. So self-selection bias is certainly a bias. Number 3 is going to be friends. And this is a tough one. And it's one that's going to be more of a problem the larger someone is in this space. It's something I didn't have to worry about at all when I had 100 subscribers. I had no friends in the space. I played board games and my friends were at the table. And as I've grown in this space, I've certainly grown to know various companies, various people in those companies. Some of them are a contact, a representative, and I just know the company and that's really it. I don't know the person. Other times, there's going to be a degree of there's a person involved, someone who I've talked to, I've engaged with, someone who I may have hung out with a few times, played their game a few times, and now I would argue that I have crossed into a line of friendliness with that person, or across time, space, whatever. There's going to be different people in this sphere. And that's absolutely going to introduce a degree of bias to, I would imagine and hope, that introduces a degree of bias to everyone. If you are friends with somebody, and you are simply willing, if you're as willing to be negative about your friend's game as you are about just a random game off the street, then I think you should be more hesitant. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I think you should be more hesitant. I think there should be a degree of bias just by the nature of they're your friend. You don't want to trash their game. That's not fun. It shouldn't be fun. You might do it because you feel an obligation to your audience, and that's fine. But if you're covering a friend's game and you think it's bad, and now you have a choice to make, literally choosing between your audience and your friend, it's going to be hard. As far as how that affects myself, speaking personally, I'm telling you right now, straight up, if I ever have to cover a friend's game and I think it's a 1 or a 2, I probably just will say, no thanks, I'm not covering it. It's doing a disservice to you, to the audience, absolutely. But I'm just not interested in hurting a friendship. It's not worth it to me. And so, if it's a 3, 4, or 5, I will. Because 3, 4, 5s are good, great, and amazing games. And if my friend is not willing to have a 3, then you shouldn't be asking me to cover your game. If your concern is I have to say your game is great or not at all, that level of obligation I don't have. I don't feel I have personally. Again, my friend might still be upset by it. There's still a degree of bias, but it's my own personal level of how that bias, in my opinion, affects me. Moving on to the next step is going to be people I'm working with. And again, just practically speaking, having reviewed games that I bought off the shelf and then acquired and never spoke to the company, and having reviewed games that companies have sent me, I've encountered both of these and I can tell you how it affects me personally. And the general idea of it is that you are less, speaking for myself, and I believe for most people, if you're interacting with a company, a person, even if it hasn't crossed into friendship, I think that there is going to be a degree of bias. This is a small space. You don't want to be, hey, thanks so much for the prototype. By the way, here's my public review where I trash that game. I've been mean to games in the past, and I've not been sure what to do next. Because usually when I'm done with a video, that a prototype, whatever it is, and I do a content for the game, I'll send the video to the publisher and say, hey, I covered it, here you go, here's my rating review. If I rated it a 2, I don't like sending it to people after. I really don't. I do, sadly. I'll say, hey, Pat, let's call him Pat, why not? Hey Pat, thanks so much for the game, really appreciate it. Here's my review. Sadly, this one wasn't for me, really apologize, but hopefully I was fair in my coverage of it. I'll throw some message in there, but it doesn't feel nice. It doesn't feel nicer to hide either, hoping that they won't notice and that they'll secretly, none of it feels nice. There's a degree of having worked with someone, with an agent, with a person, with a designer, with a publisher, where friendship or not, it's just not fun to say, I didn't like your game, and here's me publicly telling people I didn't like your game. As far as how it affects my content, it's hard to say exactly. Here's what I will say. Well, no, it's not hard to say. I don't think it affects my content. I could be wrong. I don't think it does. The relationships, again, to a certain degree, you have to have negative content if your audience is going to trust you. You have to be transparent about the things that you like, didn't like, and can see others not liking. And I specifically and structurally have a format where I can talk about what I liked, didn't like, and can see others not liking. That's part of my format, no matter how much I loved a game. And I try to be fair about it. I try to be critical. There are times where it might not be fair, where I might have a biased opinion, and I don't like it. But I think that I'm willing to do it, even though I don't love doing it. I think I'm willing to talk about how a game wasn't right for me, even though I know that on the other side of that conversation, I have to send that video to someone and say, hey, I'm sorry, your game wasn't right for me. Yeah, I don't like it, but I think I am pretty good with it. Next up is money. Now, money is going to introduce a bias for the obvious reason that you are getting a paid contract. And again, let's just talk about it different ways. I'm not talking about paid reviews. I'm not talking about someone who's whatever. I'm talking about previews, playthroughs, how to plays, where you have a degree of paid relationship with that person, and you're worried that if you don't in some way deliver on that value, they won't want to pay you money in the future. And that's absolutely a form of bias. If you paid me for a playthrough, and this is one of the reasons why I don't take money for videos. It's partially, I think there's bias either way. I've talked about this. I'm biased because I don't want to be a mean person. But that bias would further be magnified if I had a paid contract on the line. I don't think I'd lie to you. Just be very, very transparent. I don't think I'd ever tell you a bad game was good, because it would be stupid. Going back to my video on paid reviews, that would be short-sighted, it would be stupid, it would be a waste of time. But maybe a 2 could be turned into a 3. Maybe a game that I say is not a good game, maybe I turn into a 3 and still talk about the things I like and didn't like. Maybe a 3 drifts into a 4. And maybe a 4 drifts into a 5. There's room for drift, I think. I don't think there's room for straight out lying. I just think it's short-sighted. I think it's short-sighted for someone to straight up take money for something and lie about it. But I think there's room for drift in a monetarily based relationship. I think there's room for allowing yourself to say, you know what, I think that's a good game. If you play it with your kids, it's a good game. So I'll harp on the kid point and tell you how good a game it was from that stance. It's not really something that affects me because I don't take money for coverage, but it's something that I'd rather not get involved in to begin with. And we'll talk more about the money side a little bit later, but it's something that I'd rather not get involved with. There was a point earlier on in my channel where I talked about how I was willing to take money but at some point down the road. And I hope to never do so. table video today later. Aside from the table video I'll be putting up later today, which is not board games. But taking money for board game coverage, I hope to never do, if I can get away with never doing it, because I'd rather not get involved in that conversation. I'll talk about that more later in the video. Next up is people won't send me games if I'm negative. And that one's a little bit split. And there is a bit of a journey here. And we're going to talk about the journey part later. We're separating this out. But the idea that if you are negative about a game, you will not get more games. That's going to be preview coverage of Kickstarters as well as retail games. If you are too negative about different games, then people will be less likely to send you games. And that problem is a different problem depending on the size of the channel, which is why it's something I'm going to talk about a little bit more in the second half of this video, where I talk about the kind of pathway I think channels go through. But the general idea of the bias is, again, very prevalent, and I've talked about this before in a video. And the general idea comes down to, you say, hey, company X sent me a prototype, I trashed the prototype, company X is almost certainly never sending me a prototype again, and company Y and Z are less likely now that they see that I've trashed their prototype. And that applies to Kickstarters more, I think, than retail games, but it applies to both. And it's a reasonable bias. It's a reasonable degree of fear of especially as a smaller content creator, you finally hit those big leagues. A company finally pays attention to you and sends you a game for free. The $30 isn't a big deal, but the fact that a company sent you something, or if it's a prototype for a Kickstarter, it's exclusive coverage. It's a big moment. And to turn around and hurt that big moment the first time it comes out the door is not a great thing. My first prototype I ever got, I believe, was a game called Northgard, which was a game that I thought was good, but it wasn't great. And I covered it. I believe I didn't rate games back then, but I talked about the things I liked it, didn't like. It would have been a 3 out of 5 for me. I enjoyed it. And I was terrified after I did it. I was terrified that I was too mean to my first prototype. And that company just sent me another game, by the way, which is nice. But I didn't hate the game. I just didn't love it. I thought there were aspects I liked and aspects I didn't like. That's part of where I had the format of what I liked, don't like, and can see others not liking. As far as how that bias affects me, when it comes to retail games, it's going to be different. When it comes to retail games, I don't think it does. And that's only because I'm in the privileged position of being large enough that I have more games coming from publishers than I have time to review right now. Anyway, I have a backlog. I turn down things because I have a backlog, which means I'm less concerned with being negative because of the fact that, okay, fine, you won't work with me again. Some other company will. It's okay. And so I don't think I have that bias around retail games. I don't know if I ever did. I don't know. It's hard. I'd have to go back to all my videos. I don't think so. Again, I've always had a supply of games. I've always had plenty of games I could review. I don't think I've needed any degree of retail games coming my way to feel the need to pivot or lie or adjust a 2 into a 3 because of it. I can't speak for the subconscious aspect, but speaking from the conscious bias, I don't think it's there. For previews, for Kickstarter prototypes, on the other hand, I do have that bias. Going back to the friendship bias, I've said this once before on the channel, I generally, when covering prototypes for a Kickstarter, you won't see 1s and 2s. 1s, again, are incredibly rare. But I basically will tell a company, I've told companies in the past, and I will continue to tell them this, if I think your game is really, really not good for me, if I think your game is really, really not good, I won't cover it. I'm not interested in that. Or at least I'll give you the option if you want me to cover it. Because I'm not interested in... I'll explain why the nuance in a second. But then what I will do, I'll explain why I do in a second, but what I'm willing to do is 3s, 4s, and 5s. I will tell you, this game is good, but it's not for me because of X, Y, and Z. Or this game was okay, it's fine, it's great. I'll go through the whole range of 3s, 4s, and 5s, good, great, and amazing. But I won't tell you a game was a 2 if it's a prototype. And the reason for that is partially because, well, I want companies to send me prototypes so that I can actually cover them. Because retail games, I can buy them myself. You can't buy a prototype yourself. So it does allow for a degree of coverage on the channel that I would lose if I were too negative. That's one reason. Again, I don't think it's that much of a problem because fortunately this channel is large enough at this point that for the most part I could trash a prototype here and there, and trash is the wrong word. I could be overly negative about a prototype here and there, and I would still have companies willing to send me prototypes. The real reason, I think, the bigger reason, is because I'm worried about the undue harm that might exist. When it comes to a retail game, when it comes to a game that hundreds of thousands of people, not hundreds of thousands, hundreds or thousands of people can be buying that game right now and reviewing it, I don't think my coverage will have enough negative effect if I am arguably wrong. If it is a good game that isn't for me, then I don't think my coverage is going to have enough of a negative effect that it's worth it. I think I'll be overwhelmed by the general consensus as opposed to my individual voice. Whereas in the range of prototypes and previews, there are only a few channels that are willing to put out actual critical content to begin with. Most channels are going to be doing previews. And to that end, I am actually legitimately worried that my personal interest in a game. Again, let's go back to these 3 games. All 3 of these games are generally well liked by most people from what I've seen. But one of these games is absolutely not for me, and I have no interest in ever playing it again. And if I did that about a preview, about a prototype, about a game that only a handful of people are covering it, I think I might be doing undue harm because of the fact that I'm one of a few people willing to do critical coverage of prototypes. And so that's why I won't do, that's the main reason I won't do 1s and 2s. I'm worried about the undue harm. And again, also the balance of, I do want people to be able to send me. That is the degree that that bias affects us. I don't think it affects the bias of what I actually say. I think it affects the bias of what I'm willing to say at all, whether a video goes silently into the night, never to be heard from. Next up, and lastly, and this is one which I am definitely affected by, is going to be Cult of the New. There is a cult of the new out there. There is a degree of hype and excitement around the latest games. And it's something that I'm definitely victim to. I like games. I've told you this already in this video. I love this hobby. I like the games in this hobby. I like the space. I like the new, the shiny. I see the new and the shiny, and I play the new and the shiny. And something I've been trying to do more, although it still only gives you a certain degree of balance, is I've been trying more recently to give myself a week between my last play and the review. I can't always do it because of timelines. Sometimes timelines, when I get a game for coverage of prototypes, I'm not always able to do that. But I have certainly noticed that my feelings on a game will cool even a week later. It won't cool a lot necessarily, but it'll cool a little bit. That game that was new and fresh to me, I'll be like, it was new and fresh, but I don't need to play it again. I'll move on a bit. I'll move down a few half notches or something in my opinion of it. And that's just a week. But even past that, even the general idea of new and shiny, I like new and shiny. I like adding games to my collection. I like rotating my collection. Things that I haven't played in a few years start moving away. Things that are new and shiny and I'm excited about, I play. I don't view games as something that has to stick around forever. Some will. The best ones will. Most games will rotate. Most games will be good for 6 months, a year, 2, 3 years, and then it'll move on, something else takes its place. And so I am certainly biased and affected by the cult of the new. Just to slap some new art, a new theme, some new mechanics on a game, something else, just whatever it is. I'm dropping my pieces, my little treasure chests. Slap any of that onto a game, and I like it. I'm intrigued by it. I see Kickstarters for games that I've gotten rid of, but it's new and deluxeified, and I'm interested in it. Isle of Cats recently was on Kickstarter. I didn't back it the second time, but I almost backed it the second time. I was like, it's got new expansions, but I got rid of the base game, but it's got new expansions. I am pulled in by the shiny. I'm pulled in by the cult of the new. And that's more of a personal taste thing. That does affect my coverage. I try to balance for it by looking for what I didn't like and what I can see others not liking in my reviews, but it's certainly something that will be a bias. And that's going to be the 7 forms of bias that will affect content of people. Again, tell me if I've missed anything. But the general idea of this is going to be that bias is prevalent in this space. It absolutely is. And I think the way bias affects people is going to matter more depending on who you are in the space, in the timeline of being a content creator. Because I think there is a pathway people take, a pathway people go down. And I think it different forms in the pathway. Something I talked about in my video about, the no one's buying negative reviews, is the idea that negative bias also exists. There's a promotion and an incentive to be negative in the board game space because hot takes will get you an audience. And I saw a person comment, fairly, saying, oh, sure, but content creators are always like, hey, my ad revenue is buying me a cup of coffee, so there's no bias to be negative. The checks you'll get from a company are more than the few extra cents you'll get from ad revenue. And I agree with you if you're taking a short-term approach. I disagree if you're taking a long-term approach. Short-term approach, a check from a company will always be worth more money. Long-term, I think that there's a pathway to take in this space. I think that people start off with the love of the hobby. And people grow for a variety of reasons. They grow because of the types of things they cover, what they cover, how they cover them. I think there is going to be a degree of growth for being critical, for being negative, because people are always seeking that negative content. That's where the hot takes can help. Because when you have 200 subscribers, no one's writing you a check to cover the board game to begin with. Versus if you're negative enough, if you start giving your hot takes, I think you can grow faster. I think it's one of many ways. It's not the only way. I think it's one of many ways you can grow as a content creator, because people start paying attention. Look, that guy's willing to tell it like it is. And then they get an audience. And I think the audience is the most important thing. The larger you get, if you're not getting views, if you're not driving traffic, if you've lost the audience, I do not think you have value in this space. You can look at channels who have tons and tons of subscribers and the views are only going downhill because the audience isn't along for the ride. I think you want to look at where the people are paying attention. If you can carry the audience with you, look at channels like Shut Up and Sit Down, no pun included. They are fully audience focused, 100%. Look at the amount of public support they get from the audience, not just the ad revenue, but Patreons and campaigns they run. This is not meant to be attacking them at all, that's not my point. But there are opportunities to be a publicly driven channel that is willing to be negative and gets most of your revenue and support from the viewership and the public support. I think there's plenty of room for that in this space. But I think there's a pathway people take of where they are along the road. You know, when you're really, really small, it's all about just trying to get an audience to begin with. As you start to get a little traffic, you start getting some attention from publishers, and that's where the bias really starts to seep in. I would argue somewhere in the, 1,000 to 5,000 sub range is likely where you have the biggest degree of potential bias as you've started to attract the attention of publishers and you want to make those relationships work, but you have to be honest along the way, and it's a balance. But then the larger you get, I think you can drift away from the bias towards, look, this publisher is, going to send me things or not. I think the larger you get, the more you can afford to be fair and critical in your content, and publishers will risk sending you their games either way because you're large enough, you have enough of an audience that's worth the risk. I think that happens more and more. If you look, again, using the Dice Tower as a reference point, the Dice Tower is going to get sent things no matter what. They're the Dice Tower. There might be a few companies that try to avoid them, but most companies are going to send them things. They're never going to have a shortage of content because they are willing to cover enough things and people are willing to take the risk because it's worth it. They are large enough, they have enough of a voice, and their negative content may still bring you enough views and enough interest and enough buzz that it may even be worth the medium or negative content on the channel. Bias is absolutely in this. I can't lean this, it's on a pillow. Bias is absolutely in the space. It's a harder video. The reason I did this video second and the buying reviews first, buying reviews is an easy conversation. Bias is a harder one because I think bias does exist. I think I am influenced by bias. I think others are influenced by bias. I think that bias is going to be both biased towards being positive and biased towards being negative. I think that the most accurate takeaway I can say from all of this is going to be something that was commented a lot on that video and is true. Find reviewers whose tastes seem to most align with your own. Ultimately, at the end of the day, that's everything. And that's meant to be, if you're someone who watches my content and you don't align with my opinion in games, then probably you shouldn't be buying games based on my reviews. That's no harm, no foul. I don't mean it as a negative thing or as a pushing away. Watch the rest of my content. I got plenty of stuff to talk about. But, and again, using Shut Up and Sit Down as a good reference point, I love watching Shut Up and Sit Down videos. I watch almost every video they put out because I find it entertaining. But I find that their taste in games does not in any way align with my own, to the point that if they like a game, there's a higher chance I won't like it, and vice versa. So, always find the people whose tastes align with their own. You can give whatever degree of attention or time you want to the people you think are paid for, bought off, who are shills for the company. It doesn't really matter. If you found a content creator whose tastes align with your own, shill or not, their taste aligns with your own, right? So it doesn't really matter. And if they don't, then again, don't spend too much time thinking about whether someone's telling the truth or not. Just try to figure out whether their taste aligns with your own. Or watch gameplays. There's all kinds of different content out there. But yeah, harder conversation because bias absolutely exists. And that's why I didn't want to do this video just yet. I wanted more time to think it through. But it is what it is, and enough comments had me draft something together and put this out. As always, I am Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for bearing with me through these introspective moments in content. I like talking about games. I like doing top 10 lists. I like telling you, I like covering Kickstarters. I like everything in the hobby. Some of the more serious videos are some of my less fun videos. I think they're important conversations, but they're less fun because then I have to reply to all the comments too because I really want to engage in the conversation. Whereas I try to reply to all the comments anyway, but I feel more of an obligation when I have a serious conversation, as opposed to if I tell you that one of these games is awesome, I'll reply to half the comments instead. Until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co., and I hope you have a good one.